Hello everyone to this Nanitor training session. In this today's sessions, we are looking into device configurations. That means how Nanitor can help you in order to harden your devices. So my name is Alexander Eck and I'm working as a customer success manager here at Nanitor. And on the agenda today are a couple of topics that I want to discuss with you. So first of all, we are going to look into device configurations in general. So I will show you how that looks like within Nanitors. And when we talk about device configurations, all device configurations are always tied to benchmarks. So I will tell you what benchmarks we use at Nanitor, where we get them from, and how they look like. And we will then go into the benchmark score. And while we are talking about benchmark score, we also look into the difference between the benchmark score and the baseline score. So that's what we're going to cover. And you should be at the end of the session you should know what the difference between those scores is. And in regards to benchmark score or baseline scores, I will show you how you can adjust benchmarks in order to adjust also the baseline score of those benchmarks. And then we will also look into the benchmark score versus the compliance score. So there are different, another score that is displayed in Nanitor, and I will tell you where that number comes from. And then we will look into configuration issues. So each time that Nanitor is spotting a misconfiguration on any device, then Nanitor will also raise or flag an issue, and that all those issues are collected in Nanitor, and we will look into them. And in regards to those issues, we will also see how Nanitor is prioritizing those issues for you, so that you can always focus on the most important ones. And finally, we will look into several reporting options throughout Nanitor, what reports you can pull and where you can trigger or trace the progress of your configuration of your device configurations in Nanitor. So first of all, we are talking about device configurations. That also means that a correctly configured device always reduces the risk of hackers' attacks and ensures a better future protection. So, and as such, this configuration of a device is a one-time job. So you only need to do it once and then it's secure by default. It is an effective and highly recommended way to start with configurations in Nanitor or within your IT infrastructure. Nanitor creates an issue for each configuration check that fails. So we have talked about, or we will talk about lots about the benchmarks, and benchmarks have a lot of configuration checks, and each time that Nanitor is detecting a check that fails, it will raise an issue for that. And the same issue or the same configuration check can also, of course, fail on multiple assets, and as such, but still Nanitor will only flag that once, so it will only raise one issue where the configuration is not set or not properly set for one or multiple assets. All issues that are raised within Nanitor have a type misconfiguration. That also means that there are different other types, and we will going to cover those other types within other training sessions. And what you also need to know is that for each issue that is raised by Nanitor, there's always associated a risk to it. So, and Nanitor is for each check that fails, there are certain severities. So we start with the low severity, go to medium, high, and critical, and depending on the severity that they get or the issue will get a certain score. You can always override that setting if you feel to do so. But that is the basic or the default configuration or the default score of Nanitor. We will also, when you are more familiar or better familiar with Nanitor, you will also notice that Nanitor raises or has a comprehensive issue score, which is based on 3 vectors, which is based on availability, confidentiality, integrity. But for configuration issues, we only have 1 score for all of those vectors. And yeah, so something that you should also be aware of, that the same kind of issue can appear for multiple benchmarks. So that basically means there might be configuration check for password policy, but this password policy is not across all benchmarks, so it is unique for each benchmark. So as such, each kind of issue can appear for multiple benchmarks. So that is also something that you should be aware of. So benchmark, yeah. What are benchmarks and where do we get them from? We will look into those in a couple of minutes. And so, but the basic approach of Nanitor is that each device or each asset that has been populated to Nanitor gets at least assigned to 1 benchmark. And each benchmark has a couple or has multiple configuration checks or security checks that are according to the recommendations from CIS. And Nanitor is always looking into those regulations from CIS and composes its own benchmarks where no ones are available. So that might be, for example, the case for specific network devices or switches. Nanitor security switches also evaluate benchmarks. That means that each benchmark we are going to do a check or do the severity based on our experience and align those with best practices. We will also see that all the security checks from CSS have a rationale and remediation instructions, and all this information is also flowing into Nanitor. So you don't need to go anywhere else. Everything is being populated with Nanitor, and you're able to look at those information there. And last but not least, in this for benchmarks, that each security check gets assigned to a relevant compliance framework. So that is a PCI, ISO 27001, or might also other frameworks that are supported and that you have enabled within your Nanitor instance. So we will see that the bench that Nanitor will show you the score towards your or the benchmark that an asset gets assigned to. And the benchmark score is the score of past checks within a benchmark against all benchmark checks. So I have highlighted here all benchmark checks. So usually that score is then something between 50 and 70% at its highest, but then there's also the baseline score, and the baseline score is something that you can affect or that you can adjust by yourself, and that is one of the topics that we're going to do here, or of the one exercise that we're going to do. So as such, when you have an adjusted baseline, it is the baseline score is the score of past checks against selected checks in the baseline, or a subset of benchmark checks. And when you have adjusted those, the benchmarks or the baseline score, you should be able to fulfill those baseline, and we always and should always aim for a baseline score between 90 and 100%. So by the end of the day, that is something that how it should look like during the journey of Nanitor. So when you have populated your devices within Nanitor, you usually get a score between 40 and 60% by default, depending on the asset that you have. But you should then by adjusting those baselines and exclude certain checks, you should then, and of course then also by the end of the day, you should also of course really do the work and configure your devices properly. So by the end of the day, you should be somewhere between have a baseline score at least which is higher than 90% and a compliance score which should be something around 70% or higher. And I will give you a brief look how things can look like for an instance that I have here available. So when we look into Nanitor, we go into configurations, which will give you a compliance rate report. And here are the certain, or what we see here are benchmarks. And we will take a we will take a shortcut, and I will go to download the benchmarks, and from the benchmarks you will see or from the download center from CIS you will see all those benchmarks. And when we go back here, so let's take a look, for example, at some servers that we have here for the CentOS 7 devices, for example, and you will notice here that Nanitor is flagged then as level 1 for server. So let's take a look at CentOS. So let's take a look for CentOS. CentOS is here, CentOS Linux, and there are several versions, 6, 7, and 8, and we can of course easily download that report. And once you open that up, you will get this benchmark, and that is exactly what you are going to see within Nanitor. So these benchmarks are split into several chapters, as you probably see here. But one thing that is very common in Nanitor is that the numbering system within those benchmarks is not exactly the same as Nanitor, and the reason for it is that CIS is also changing its numbering system quite often, so it is not really reliable. So as such, we try to, of course, to have the numbering system as close as possible to CIS, but this is not always given. So the same numbers that you see here and in Nanitor are not exactly the same. But so here, and if you then go to one of those, you will probably see here, this is the number, and this is the title of the security check that is going to be done, and here you have the profile that it is available, and you will also see here a level 1, 2, or 3. So when we look, for example, for level 2, so you will also see that there are several checks that are for level 2 or even level 3. Just want to ensure here that we are not taking level 2 or 3 into consideration, so we only looking into level 1. So that's also the reason why our benchmarks are marked as level 1. So, and you will sometimes see here that for what is appropriate is a level 1 workstation or level 2 server, and so on. So that's what you're going to see here. And So let's say, for example, we see this check here, and there's the description, the rationale why that is important. The audit means what is the check to be done, and here's the remediation. So if that check fails, you will see here what is the remediation order to make sure to fix that configuration issue. And that's, of course, by the end of the day, that's something that you need to do. And all this information is also flowing into Nanitor. So when we open up here, heading back to Nanitor, our Nanitor instance, back into Nanitor and clicking on this benchmark within Nanitor, you will also see here, very similar to what we have seen in the benchmark, the several chapters here and the numbering system. Like I said, the numbering system is not exactly the same, but the title is always the same, what you also see in the benchmark. So when we look at that, for example, the first one here, and I'll just open it up again, and we are looking for that same check, we will also see that this check is also here. So that is basically very similar to what we see within Nanitor. So each check has a certain, so what we see here for each check. So what do we see for each? The first thing that we see is if it is included in the baseline, yes or no. And here we see the score and the amount of asset that it is referring to. So Nanitor has detected 5 assets that belong to this benchmark, and from those 5 assets, 4 checks have failed and 1 has passed. That basically means that the score for this specific check is at 20%. And here also we have that severity. That's what I mentioned earlier. So a severe configuration issue is ranked with 9 out of 10. And here in the last, we also see the recent activity within the last 90 days. And here on top, we have the score of the all of assets, which is 70.75%. So here on the left-hand side, we can do a lot of things. So we can also then filter on some things, on some configuration checks that are important for our IT infrastructure. So for example, so here are some content filters or context filters that I would like to explain a little bit in detail. So here's also again the severity that we can filter on, and of course we can filter on critical or high severity. And here is in other checks that we have is if you would like to check on rules that are within the baseline and rules that are not within the baseline. So now for this example, I get all rules that are within the baseline. So that also means that everything here is a yes. I can also here now check that, and I want to display both checks that are within the baseline and not in the baseline. So when there's a rule or a check that is not within the baseline, it is not taking into the consideration of my baseline score. So I have, it is not in that check. And here there's also an option where I can filter on with broken assets or without broken assets. So broken asset in that sense basically means that the check has failed at least on one device. Or if I check here without broken asset, it means that all assets have passed that security check. So this is the way how you can use or leverage the filters in order to filter out on checks that are important. So now I could, for example, say, okay, are there any severity or high high severity configuration checks that are not in the baseline and that I have passed. No, they are not. And I could go down the road and I'll say, for example, for all medium severity checks, there are some checks that I'm passing, and so you basically but are not within my baseline. So that also means the more checks I put in my baseline that I have fulfilled, that will also change my score. And that's what I basically can do by overriding a check. So let's say, for example, we want to do something which makes maybe a little bit sense. Network configuration. So you see the things or the checks that are outside of my baseline are pretty much really what we consider best practice. So disable auto mounting is of course something that is maybe not that important, or we consider as might not be inside worth to include in the baseline. But since I have checked all or passed all checks, it might be good for me to do so. So I can here now override and say, okay, from this checks I want to include that into baseline and make some comment to it. And I could also here, for example, now override the severity of that check if that fails, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to just save and close. So I will see now here that now finally this is now marked as within the baseline, and maybe opening up the same again. We will also see some additional information here, and I mentioned in my beginning slides that each device configuration or each configuration check here is related to a compliance framework, or usually it is. And in this case, for example, you will see that it is related to ISO 27001. So looking into compliance report, we will also see that issue here when it's failed in the compliance report as such. What else can we see here? We see, of course, all the assets that are related or inside for that benchmark and how many of those have passed that check. Again, the description, rationale, remediation, and so on. So we see also now here the change log. So everything I do change is logged. So that's of course very good, and it is also logged by who has been done that. So we have a very good comprehensive audit logging here. When you also want to send that this as or these instructions for remediation to certain recipient, you can also do from here. So all the users are already populated here from your AD or from all the users that are using Nanitor or registered within Nanitor. You can also send that to your network administrators or for people who are doing the remediation and send that to them. Okay, so now we have changed that here, and now what you could do here, for example, is create a refresh, and by creating that refresh we will also see now that the score has changed, because what we actually did, we included one more check inside the baseline or into the baseline that we have already passed. So that means that for that reason I haven't done basically anything. I have not really configured any of my devices or made them more secure. I just added more device checks inside my baseline, and for that reason and check that I have added to the baseline, I have passed that on all devices. So I'm here, or I have actually raised my baseline score for that specific benchmark. And that is something that you should, of course, do for all of your benchmark. That will take, of course, a time. So really go through each single of those items or those checks and make sure that they are in alignment with your technical policy, that they are in alignment with what you think is secure. We give you best advices, we give you best practice approach, but of course you can always override these settings by including checks into your benchmark that we do not consider, or vice versa, or also override the severity of your checks. But of course what you should focus on is for sure critical, high and medium severity before you go into other severity levels like low. Okay, so what else do we need to cover here? Nothing for at the moment. So we see now here our benchmark is still showing the old value. So we are going to do a refresh, and then we will see that here has been adjusted. So you will also notice here and see how many rules are within that specific benchmark. So there are 94 checks that are within that specific benchmark. But when we're looking into ISO, so there are much more checks, but that are within that benchmark. But we are only taking into consideration these 94. And when we are looking later on, we will also see then the benchmark score, and generally we'll then also see that the benchmark score is usually lower than the baseline score. That's usually the case. And then we also see here the ISO or the compliance score. So the compliance score is another score that is taking into consideration the severity of the past text. So when we are looking into benchmark score or baseline score, and it is only basically checking pass or a fail of the check, and it's not taking into consideration the severity of the issue itself, but the weighted score of the compliance framework is taking that into consideration. So that also means that when you have failed a check that is with a higher severity or a critical severity, it will lower your score, and vice versa. A lower or a low or a check with a low severity will raise your score quite minimal. So what we also see here from this within this benchmark, there are 38 issues detected, and we have 5 assets on within that certain benchmark that we're looking at. And here on the right hand side, there's also this audit report. So the audit report is taking everything into consideration. We can take a look at it and summing everything up that we have seen online, and yeah, having a quite a good view. And you can also then really convert or export this report into PDF. Going back, so now really and when I click here now on the 5 assets of that benchmark, we will basically also see here all the assets that are within that certain benchmark. And here are my 5 assets, and the asset state, and also the baseline score. So the baseline score is that what we have covered, and we will of course see the baseline score is different between my devices. So there might be some devices that have a higher score than others, and on the front page we will see the average score of my assets. and the same is with the ISO or the weighted ISO 27001 score. Here's the risk rating of the asset. So this is basically the inventory or the asset list here. That is something that we're going to cover somewhere else, but just wanted to show you that when you're clicking on the assets, it will bring you to the asset page or to the device list pages or inventory with a pre-filtered or preset filter on that specific benchmark here. And the same story is to tell when you click on the issues here. So clicking on the 38 issues will reveal you a list of these 38 issues that have been detected within that certain benchmark. And all those issues are always labeled with the benchmarking beforehand. So I also mentioned very earlier that the same issue might pop up for different benchmarks. So you might, for example, have an issue for ensure permissions on etc password, which is not only on CentOS 7, but also on CentOS 8 or 6, or on other Ubuntu benchmarks, for example. But then you will get multiple issues for each of those. It will only always create one issue for all of those benchmarks. And as such, the issue name is, or the issue itself is named according to the benchmark where it has been found on. Here are all these 38 issues, and you probably see that they are by default they are filtered by its risk score. So all of them seems are weighted very with a high risk or with a high issue risk. We have also seen, or I have told you that in the very beginning that the critical issue can be a maximum of 9. So this is rated as a 9. But you will also see that so when you're not doing anything with about the things that Nanitor detected, Nanitor is elevating those issues. So that is of course a completely different story, but just for you to know, and why you might wonder why there's a score of 10 instead of 9. So but when you hover over it, you will see that the default risk here, or the initial risk, was 7, but it got elevated to 10 because of its age and the severity on the most critical asset. So which give you a score here of 100 and the amount of assets. So what you can also of course do here is putting that into certain project. That's another tutorial or training session that we're going to look into. But for now, it's just only for you to rectify or to notice where the link from the front page is leading you. So it is the link from the asset, or the number of assets is leading you to the inventory page of your assets, but the number of issues of your benchmark is leading you to the issues list of Nanitor. And it is pre-filtered, so you will see it has a context filter here enabled, which is based on the benchmark, which you are not able to view from here, but this is behind the scenes. And here you can of course also do the misconfiguration, right? So that will still show you the 38 issues here. Okay, so we're going back to configurations, and we have pretty much covered here the overview page. What is quite useful here is the configuration, or the configuration trend report, which is available here from the trend matrix, and that will show you how you're doing over time. So, and here's basically where you also see the benchmark score. So I mentioned that the benchmark score and the baseline score are two different things. So the benchmark score is really taking into consideration all checks no matter if they are within the baseline or outside the baseline. So you can of course manipulate. You can always adjust the baseline score, but you with just some settings within Nanitor. That's what I have been showing you. But the benchmark score is a score that you do not have an influence on unless you're going into your assets or devices and fixing the things that Nanitor is flagging to you. So the benchmark score is really not doing is not, you are not going to raise the benchmark score until you really do anything about that. So, and what you also see here is both the benchmark score and the baseline score. And of course, ideally, these lines should go trend up and not down. But it can also be the case, and in this case, for example, that you also see the amount of assets that you have within your instance. So you will also see here the amount of assets over time. So it is very common that when you add more assets into Nanitor or into the monitoring tool, it will the baseline score or the benchmark score will drop because they are not as well configured as the already configured assets within Nanitor. So as such, that might also be one explanation why a baseline or a score is dropping here. But as you probably can see here, for example, for the Windows 10 machines, people have been doing a great job here and putting up the baseline to almost 100%. So that's something that we want to see. And the same story is to tell about other baseline, but you will probably also see here that when the flat or when the lines, of course, really flat, like here for the Ubuntu devices, Debian or the CentOS devices, that basically means we or you haven't done anything in regards to adjust those baselines or to harden your devices by adjusting the configurations of your devices. But of course, you cannot be all over the place, and you should always set your clear goals for one or a couple of benchmarks to start with, and then go from there and adopt the same methodology on other benchmarks as well. Okay, other reports that we can look into are, for example, here in the report section, there are also the compliance issues or the compliance report, and that's I came into that quite early, where we have seen all those configurations issues. They are always assigned or linked to a compliance framework. So in my case here, I have the ISO 27001 framework, but I could also switch that to another framework that is available or that I have decided to monitor within my instance, but we are just going to stay for the ISO 27001 report, and you will see that there are a couple of P0, P1, or P2 issues. Like I said, that is another chapter or another topic for another training session as such, what that exactly means. But when you look, for example, here, these are all the misconfiguration issues that we have. So there might be, of course, other issues within Nanitor, but what Nanitor is doing, these are the chapters from the ISO 27001 framework, and Nanitor is always showing you which to which control or to which chapter, ISO 27001 chapter, an issue belongs to. So that is being done behind the scenes. That is something which is hard coded, but will also show you in very quickly and in a very good view what what issues you have within certain areas for example, for misconfiguration. And that's what we're only looking at here for right now. Okay, so that's pretty much it for now. Yeah, I would like to thank you for your attention, and see you around for the next training session within Nanitor. Thank you.